The city had stood for 1,000 years. It had survived Vandals and Persians, Arabs and Bulgarians. It had endured the wrath of Attila the Hun and the fury of the Crusaders. The walls of Constantinople were not just stone and mortar. They were legend. For over a millennium, they had protected the heart of Roman civilization, the seat of an empire that claimed direct lineage from Augustus and Constantine the Great. But in the spring of 1453, legend would meet its end. The year was 1453. The Ottoman Empire, a rising power that had already consumed much of the Balkans and Anatolia, had set its sights on the greatest prize. Constantinople, the queen of cities, the capital of what remained of the Byzantine Empire, and at the head of this massive campaign stood a young man barely out of boyhood, Sultan Mehmed II, 21 years old, possessed of an ambition that would reshape the world. To understand what happened on those May nights, we must first understand what Constantinople represented. This was not merely a city. This was the continuation of Rome itself. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, the Eastern Roman Empire lived on, eventually becoming what we now call the Byzantine Empire. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople had been the center of Christian civilization, the seat of Eastern Orthodoxy, and the guardian of the classical heritage of Greece and Rome. Its walls were considered impregnable. Its strategic position controlling the Bosphorus Strait made it the most important city in the world. The Theodosian walls, built in the 5th century under Emperor Theodosius II, were the most sophisticated fortifications of the medieval world. 3 lines of defense, a massive outer wall, a narrower inner wall, and a deep moat protected the city from land attacks. These walls had never been breached by a foreign army. They had survived every siege thrown against them. Generations of Byzantine generals had rested easy behind their stone ramparts, believing themselves protected by God's own hand. But the walls that had defied armies for 1,000 years would now face something new: gunpowder. Mehmed II was not your typical Ottoman sultan. While his predecessors had contented themselves with their Asian holdings, Mehmed had set his sights on Europe. He spoke multiple languages, studied classical literature, and surrounded himself with advisors who understood the value of new technology. Most importantly, he understood that the old ways of siege warfare would not suffice against Constantinople's legendary defenses. He needed something that had never been seen before. That something was a cannon, or rather a collection of cannons, the largest of which had never been imagined in the medieval world. The Hungarian engineer Urban had built for the Byzantines a massive bombard that could fire stone balls weighing over 1,000 pounds. When the Byzantine emperor refused to pay the full price, Urban took his skills to the Ottomans. Mehmed paid whatever was asked. The great bombard was transported to the Ottoman camp with great difficulty, requiring dozens of oxen and hundreds of men. When it finally was placed in position and fired for the first time, the sound was so tremendous that it reportedly shook the ground for miles. The stone ball struck the Theodosian walls and knocked chunks of masonry loose. For the first time in history, the supposedly impenetrable walls showed their vulnerability. But the cannon alone would not be enough. Constantinople was massive, with walls stretching over 5 kilometers. Mehmed needed a strategy. What he devised was both simple and brilliant. He would build a completely new approach to siege warfare. First, he needed to control the Bosphorus. The city was supplied by sea, with Genoese and Venetian ships bringing food and reinforcements. But the Ottomans controlled the European side of the Bosphorus. What they lacked was the ability to block the sea access from the Asian side. Mehmed ordered the construction of a massive chain that would be stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn, the inlet that brought ships into the heart of the city. When the Genoese ships attempted to break through, They were caught in a naval battle and forced to withdraw. But still, Constantinople held. The walls, despite the pounding of the great bombard, still stood. The defenders, though vastly outnumbered, fought with the desperation of men who knew that defeat meant death or slavery. Their patriarch, the spiritual leader of Eastern Orthodoxy, walked the walls giving blessings. He told them that God would not abandon his city. The walls of Constantinople had been consecrated by centuries of prayer. For weeks the siege dragged on. The Ottomans camped outside the walls with roughly 80,000 men. Inside, the Byzantines could field perhaps 7,000 defenders, far too few to man the entire wall. They relied on the strength of the fortifications to make up for their lack of numbers, but the odds were never in their favor. Mehmed tried another approach. Negotiation. He offered Emperor Constantine the 11th terms that were, by the standards of the time, remarkably generous. The emperor could remain in power as a subordinate ruler, keeping his lands and his title. He would pay tribute to the Sultan and acknowledge Ottoman sovereignty. The churches would remain standing. The Christian faith would be preserved. It was perhaps the best offer the Byzantines would ever receive, but Constantinople had never fallen to a Muslim army. The legacy of 1,000 years of resistance held fast. The emperor's advisors counseled against surrender. How could they explain to future generations that they had given up without a fight? How could they face their ancestors who had died defending these walls? The answer, however tragic, was almost certain: they could not. And so the siege continued. On May 29, 1453, Mehmed launched his final assault. He had divided his army into 3 waves. The first were the irregular troops, the volunteers and mercenaries who served as cannon fodder. Their job was to tire the defenders, to exhaust them before the main assault. The second wave were the trained Ottoman infantry, the elite janissaries, the Sultan's personal guard. They would press the attack when the defenders were worn down. The third wave, held in reserve, was the Sultan's own household troops. The defenders had been warned that the assault would come at night, but the hours passed and nothing happened. Many of the Byzantine soldiers, exhausted by weeks of constant vigilance, fell asleep at their posts. The Genoese mercenaries who fought alongside them, their captain Giustiniani was one of the most respected military commanders of the age, tried to keep them alert, but there were simply not enough of them to cover every section of the wall. Around midnight, the Ottoman forces began to move. The first wave crashed against the walls like a tidal wave. The defenders, though surprised, fought back with whatever weapons they could find. Stones were thrown, arrows rained down, boiling oil was poured on the attackers. The first wave was repelled. So too was the second. It seemed as though the walls would hold, as they always had. But then something happened that the defenders had not anticipated. A small gate in the wall, the Kirkaporta, was left open. This was not an act of treachery. It was simply a mistake, perhaps caused by the chaos of battle. Ottoman soldiers spotted the open gate and poured through. For a moment, the defenders managed to close it, trapping some of the attackers inside. But the damage was done. The element of surprise was gone. The Ottomans were inside the walls. At this critical moment, the great chain that protected the Golden Horn was broken. This was either an act of sabotage or simply the result of the battle's chaos. The exact details have been lost to history. Whatever the cause, it allowed Ottoman ships to sail directly into the harbor, threatening the city from 2 directions. Now the battle devolved into the streets. The Byzantines fought building by building, house by house. There was no retreat, no surrender. Every street became a battlefield. The Ottomans, now inside the walls, had the advantage of numbers. They pushed toward the heart of the city, toward the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, where the emperor had ordered the defense to make its final stand. Emperor Constantine XI the last Roman emperor fought alongside his men. There was no hiding in the palace, no escape to safety. He was the emperor of Rome, and Rome did not flee. According to legend, when it became clear that the battle was lost, he removed his imperial insignia and joined the ranks of common soldiers. Dying like any other warrior defending his city, his body was never identified. The fall of Constantinople was not merely the end of an empire. It was the closing of a chapter in human history that had lasted for over 1,000 years. The Eastern Roman Empire, the direct continuation of the ancient Roman state, was gone. The last emperor had died defending its walls. The great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, for over 1,000 years a symbol of Christian glory, was converted into a mosque. But the story does not end there. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves throughout Europe. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire had served as a buffer between the Islamic world and Christian Europe. Now that buffer was gone. The Ottoman Empire, with Constantinople as its new capital, now threatened to expand into Europe itself. Within decades, they would reach the gates of Vienna. Yet in another sense, the fall of Constantinople marked a beginning, not just an end. The scholars who fled the city brought with them the classical knowledge preserved in its libraries. This knowledge, transmitted to Italy and the rest of Europe, helped spark the Renaissance. The fall of the Byzantine Empire contributed to the age of exploration, as European nations sought new routes to Asia that would bypass the now Ottoman-controlled trade routes. In this way, the death of one empire helped birth the modern world. Mehmed II, now known as Mehmed the Conqueror, made Constantinople the capital of his empire. He built new mosques, new palaces, new walls. He invited people from across his empire to settle in the city, repopulating what had been a declining metropolis. He preserved many of the Christian churches and allowed the Orthodox Church to continue functioning under Ottoman rule. In his own way, he saw himself as a successor to the Roman emperors, a new Constantine, building a new empire on the foundations of the old. The walls of Constantinople, those legendary fortifications that had protected the city for over a millennium, were largely dismantled over the following centuries. Today only fragments remain, scattered throughout modern Istanbul like the broken teeth of a giant. But the memory of what they protected, and what ultimately overcame them, still resonates. The fall of Constantinople was not just a military event. It was a transformation of the world. The center of gravity shifted from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. New powers would rise, new empires would fall, new technologies would reshape warfare. But the lessons of that May night in 1453 still hold. No fortress is truly impregnable, no empire truly eternal, and the course of history can change in a single moment. In the end, the walls of Constantinople fell, not because of one cannon or one gate or one mistake. They fell because the world had moved on. The medieval age was ending, and a new age was beginning. The Ottomans had gunpowder and ambition. The Byzantines had relics and tradition. And in the clash between these two forces, the future was born. This is the story of the fall of Constantinople. Not just the siege, not just the battle, but the transformation of everything that followed. This is the moment when the Roman Empire truly ended, and when the modern world truly began.